So before internationally agreed borders were a thing, you had approximate borders. Historical empires before more modern times didn't just say the border went along X latitude and Y longitude. They would use landmarks. So if someone wanted to draw a map of that empire, you'd have to choose how to interpret these more vague boundaries. Where do you draw these lines when your best information is, somewhere over there? This is a problem that many historical map makers have run into. Sometimes you get borders along rivers that are clear and precise, like with the northern limits of the Roman Empire, but more often than not, it's natural boundaries. Maybe there's a mountain range that serves as a border, so the natural solution is to draw a line down the middle of the mountain range. But what about desert borders? Well, usually the solution is to just draw an approximate line from one edge of settlement to the other. After all, it's literally lines in the sand, it's fine. But some empires would have unique situations where that isn't the best solution. While there are multiple examples of this problem, the biggest one I can think of is for a border that went through modern-day Libya. The Ottoman Empire in particular had a province in modern-day Libya named Tripolitania. There were periods where it was more directly controlled by the Ottomans or more autonomous. As the Ottoman Empire lasted into the 19th century, they wanted to place more direct control over the province, especially as the empire was declining and losing land. Through administrative reforms, the Ottomans decided to subdivide the provinces into sanjaks for better governing. For Tripolitania in particular, one of these sanjaks was named Fezzan, and it wasn't along the edges of the Sahara Desert, it was directly in the desert. There were people living there, and trade routes went through it, so it was considered important for the Ottomans. Now, how do we map it? While the 19th century is more modern than medieval or ancient times, deserts were some of the last areas on the planet to still not have precise borders. And since the sanjak is in the desert, you can't just draw a line along the edge of the desert near the coast. So therein lies the problem. And maps do not seem to have a consensus on this border either. Some of you might think, we'll just draw a dotted line or a dashed line to indicate a more rough border. While that is perfectly reasonable, and some maps have done so, you still have to draw that dotted line somewhere, just like with a solid one. Same if you decided to do some fancy color fade option too. So what are the different ways different maps have drawn borders along here? Solution 1, the dip. This one is the most straightforward. Okay, so you can't draw a straight-ish line, then just do a dip into Fezzan and go around it. It's still lines in the sand, it gets the idea done. I've seen some maps do a general broad dip, some that do a narrower one, and some that go deeper than others. That's partially for a reason that will be explained later. While this is probably the most common choice I've seen, they can't even agree on what kind of dip in the map they're making. So it's hardly a consensus. You could probably divide this solution into solutions 1 through 10 if you really wanted to, but it's ultimately the same idea. Solution 2, the sawtooth border. So the first ever map of the Ottoman Empire I saw was from the C.S. Hammond Historical Atlas Volume 1, where they made a map of the growth of the Ottoman Empire. Their choice was to draw this weird jagged border that almost seems like it's a saw blade of some kind. The reasoning for this is based on oases and small settlements along some of the trade routes that go through the Sahara Desert. In theory, since the Ottomans are the source of half the traffic on these routes, and these oases are essential to keep the trade possible, it would be logical to show at minimum these points within Ottoman control. So you're drawing lines in the desert in this angled fashion to include those. One thing that does back this border up slightly is that when the Italians acquired Libya from the Ottomans in 1912, its border with French West Africa seemed to follow these lines to some degree. France would cede these areas to Italy in 1919 on paper, but technically it wasn't well defined either, and the level of France or Italy's actual control was very minimal at best. Not to mention, colonial borders don't tend to care about previous borders anyway. For all I know, this sawtooth border is maybe retroactive from the original Italian border. I don't know. Solution 3, the circle. Basically solution 2, except it's a more rounded ending. It's much broader than the dip since it still incorporates itself based around these oasis points, but I guess some people think it looks better like this rather than a sawtooth, I guess. I also imagine that for people that digitally make maps by using shapefiles, this is probably an easier option since you don't have to worry about so many sharp turns on the border. Or are less round shapes easier? You know what, I have no idea. Answer in the comments if you know, because I've never used shape files or anything like that. I just do most of my maps on this channel by drawing in MS Paint. Solution 4, De facto to the max. Some mapmakers take accuracy to such a painful degree that some argue that if Ottoman soldiers aren't actively able to regularly go there, then it doesn't count as a part of the empire, since technically there's no international agreement on the border there. It's a rare choice, mainly because it is by far the ugliest choice, but for mapmakers who want to split hairs, this is their option. I suppose some additional logic is that most of the desert is dunes, and no one is living on those dunes, let alone marching soldiers through them. So it makes sense to show control in between them, specifically along the trade routes and the cities, but nothing more. But looking at the satellite map, you could maybe also see arguments for just including them by going around them too, in the same way that you might with mountain ranges, since they're just as much of a barrier for the outside as well as the inside. I suppose it's all a matter of perspective. Solution 5. What Fezzan? To be fair, the Ottomans didn't always have a presence in Fezzan, so some maps showing the Ottoman Empire may not be covering the time periods they did control it, but some maps just elect to keep the border near the coast and not bother mapping Fezzan at all, which doesn't seem like a valid solution, but it is something I have seen a lot. So basically, most of these options revolve around the question of what it means to actually control territory. Sure, the argument of Ottoman soldiers not being stationed there supports the idea of more limited control, but on the other hand, soldiers are never stationed in every single town under a nation or empire's control to begin with. If you say the ability to send soldiers there matters, well, the Ottomans could send soldiers there whether they controlled it or not. The US can send soldiers to anywhere on the planet. Does that mean they own it? No. What about paying taxes? Sure, that can help narrow it down to towns you control if the empire is receiving taxes from there, but that still leaves the question of the borders around those towns. Not even the minimalist de facto style maps would choose to show the empires as nothing but connect the dots. Now, I've seen this situation in other historical maps for other places, like the Arabian Desert, boundaries for tribal entities, control in a rainforest area such as the Amazon, but in a lot of these cases it's about a dispute whether the empire or the indigenous population truly controls the area, and less about how that border is actually drawn between them. Now, at the end of the day, most of the people wanting a map of the Ottoman Empire aren't really going to care. They see that the Ottomans control this bit of land somewhat, and that's good enough. In theory, we want maps to be as accurate as possible, but when it comes to such broad, vague boundaries, the truth is much more perspective-based than anything. I tend to personally support the sawtooth option, mainly because it seems like the compromise between a broad circle and a minimalist boundary, but usually some variation of the dip is more common or simply not showing Fezzan at all. But I'm actually interested to see what you all think, so I made a Google survey poll to see which solution you guys think is the best, as well as a few other questions on aesthetics versus precision when it comes to maps. I figure after about a week of answers or longer, I could do a live stream and share the results with everyone, so the link to that is in the description below. And additionally, if there's any other weirdly specific quirky map thing you think would make for an interesting discussion in a future video, by all means post it in the comments. I'm Emperor Tiger Star, and I'll see you guys next time. If you like this video and you want to see more, you can support this channel either with memberships or by joining my Patreon, where you can see videos early and occasional progress reports on ongoing projects.